Salam alaikum, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 233, Friendship in Dark Times. In 1253 BCE, regnal year 40, the king of southern and northern Egypt, Ramesses II, had reached his early 60s. He was still healthy, still vigorous, still an active ruler. Pharaoh could now look back on 4 decades of rule, with many landmarks to celebrate. Most recently, the king had welcomed a new queen. In year 34, Ramesses had achieved what he considered to be a great diplomatic victory. The king and queen of Hatti had sent their daughter to marry Ramesses. She arrived in Egypt and took on the name Ma'at Hor Neferu Ra, and a year or two after the marriage, she and Ramesses produced their first child, a daughter, descendant of 2 royal houses. Ramesses had his prize from Hatti, a young woman to be his queen, but soon enough it was time to reciprocate. Around year 40, Pharaoh received a most important guest. The prince of Hatti, son of the great king, came to the Nile Valley with an urgent request. For some time now, the Hittite heartland had been experiencing food shortages. A combination of factors, including drought and political instability, had left the great king unable to fill his granaries. We have heard about this issue previously when Ramesses was negotiating for his Hittite wife. Back then, the queen of Hatti had mentioned a food shortage and that, quote, "I have no grain in my lands." Now, about 7 years later, the problem continued, or had repeated. It was serious enough that Hattusili asked for help. One of Ramesses' letters, excavated at Hattusa, reports the situation. He tells us that the prince, named Hishmi Sharuma, had arrived in Egypt during winter, maybe December or January. He then spent several weeks in Egypt until the northern spring. Presumably, Ramesses had laid on the full tourist experience, his agents showing Prince Hishmi around their great city, Ramesses, with its gilded temples and towering obelisks. Maybe the Hittites had visited the fortresses to see the mighty walls and strong battalions, including the Sherden warriors, whom Ramesses kept as bodyguards. Surely they must have showed the prince the Nile Delta, with its incredible fertility, winding waterways and canals, not to mention the stockpiles of their granaries and warehouses. Hopefully it achieved the desired effect, demonstrating to this prince, perhaps a future king of Hatti, that Egypt was a land of splendor and immense resources. Finally, the business of the day. The Hittites would plead their case before Pharaoh himself, seeking the god's approval for their humble request. Fortunately, agreement was reached, and in his letter, Ramesses promises aid. A fleet of transport ships would carry grain to the Hittite lands. What's more, this wasn't a one-off. Ramesses promised ongoing supplies. Quote, "They, the ships, shall be sent back from the land of Hatti to the land of Egypt every month, year after year. Let the prince of Hatti, Hishmi Sharuma, go to receive all the ships, which have been supplied with barley and with wheat, and he shall send the ships back to Egypt to carry out more work." End quote. Henceforth, Egypt's royal granaries would fund Hattusili's household. I think we can view this as the other side of the marriage deal. Ramesses had received a beautiful bride and her lavish dowry. Now it was his obligation to sustain his distant family in a time of need. Of course, as the old saying goes, give a Hittite grain and you feed them for a month. Teach them to grow grain and you feed them forever. Or something like that. On that note, Ramesses did not merely send transport ships. He also dispatched advisors. Quote, "Behold, when Hishmi Sharuma came, he arrived in the months of cold, and when the year brought its spring, he lingered a while. Now I send Aya of the royal house, and Nacha of the water drawing commission, and Rhea also of the water drawing commission, a total of 3 distinguished men. I send them to you as messengers, together with the great gift." End quote. It seems that Ramesses dispatched officials who belonged to the group called Great Ones, or Supervisors of Water. These were the overseers of irrigation and canals in Egypt's floodplains. The two men in particular, Nacha and Rea, had worked at Ramesses' great memorial temple, the Ramesseum in Luxor. Now they were exchanging the fertile river valley for the dry mountain valleys of central Anatolia. Why did Ramesses dispatch these men to such a distant and unusual land? What could the Egyptians offer to Hittite farmers? Well, it may relate to a Hittite policy that turns up just a few years later. Hattusili's successor, a king named Tudkhaliya IV, began constructing dams and reservoirs at major towns throughout his kingdom. Archaeologists have discovered several of these reservoirs, and it's speculated that the Hittites may have been trying to reduce their dependence on rainfall in favor of more irrigation on their farmland. It's possible that the Egyptian engineers, with their experience in canals, rivers, and levee management, might contribute to those efforts. I'm speculating there. We have no direct proof of what Nacha or Rea did, but that might be the explanation. Anyway, a fleet was on its way with the promise of regular deliveries for the foreseeable future. The Pharaoh's letter doesn't say how many ships were traveling, or their capacity, or the raw quantity of grain, so we don't know how much aid Ramesses was providing. Fortunately, archaeological work at Hittite sites does give some clues. On the western coast of Syria, for example, the great city of Ugarit was one of Hatti's most important vassals. Ugarit was a port city and a central hub in the trade networks that crossed this region. For the Hittites, generally active on land more than the sea, the rulers of Ugarit and their ships were a vital part of their economic system. We see this in letters excavated at Ugarit that record communication between the city, its neighbors, and Hatti. There are dozens of these letters, but two in particular stand out. The first one comes from the Lord of Ugarit, who wrote a letter to an Egyptian governor based in Canaan. The Ugarite asked the Egyptian to send him 15 tons of grain. He paid for this with a large quantity of wool and silver, although the Lord of Ugarit did say that part of his payment had been stolen, quote, by my enemies. Apparently there were difficulties in Syria, and the local princes were willing to pay handsomely for food security. The fact that they went to Egypt rather than their overlord in Hatti might give another hint of the problems afflicting the Hittites. In another message, the king of Hatti himself wrote to Ugarit, requesting their help with a food delivery. This one sounded urgent. Quote, according to what the king, your master, says, act in every way. Currently, the city of Ura lacks everything, and they have asked the king for supplies. I have assigned to them 2,000 measures of grain. You, for your part, must provide them with a large ship and crewmen, and let them take this grain to their land. Do not deprive them of a ship. This is a matter of life or death. End quote. Those 2,000 measures of grain were approximately 500 metric tons, 490 imperial. In theory, that could feed as many as 45,000 people for a month. The ruler's urgency is clear in that final statement. This is a matter of life and death. Clearly, communities in Hatti were in dire need of supply. Naturally, we start to wonder, has the Bronze Age collapse begun, at least in Hatti? Ramesses' grain shipments, the letters from Ugarit, and others from the region explicitly point to shortages in Hattusa. Meanwhile, archaeological sites across the eastern Mediterranean, including Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and Turkey, point to slow but significant declines in agricultural activity during the 13th century BCE. Studies of pollen, for example, and the trace materials of farming suggest that a long-term drought was beginning to affect the region. That would explain why Ramesses dispatched water experts, and why the Hittites started building reservoirs. Putting these factors together, we might see the beginnings of an unfolding calamity. To be clear, The Hittites were not done yet. Food shortages had happened before, and the King of Hatti clearly had mechanisms for bringing in supply. In 1253, Hattusili might reasonably think, "This is a difficult period, but we'll get through it." For Hittitologists, these years of hunger are a significant chapter, but their nature and impact remain slightly murky. That is a bigger story for a forthcoming chapter, but for now, it might be reasonable to say that, in hindsight, the first hints of the collapse are coming into view. Dark clouds may have been on the horizon, but in 1250 BCE, regnal year 40, it was still business as usual. Ramesses' letters to Hattusili continued, and they show no anxiety over the climate or concern about distant communities. Still, Pharaoh was helpful to his northern brother, and he laid out additional resources to support Hattusili. A fleet of Egyptian ships would now bring food regularly, but if that hunger continued, the Hittites would need more aid, and they would need to build their own ships for transport. In another letter, Pharaoh reported that he had dispatched 2 additional ships to Hatti, and he sent them for a specific reason. Ramesses instructed Hattusili, quote, "These ships, your carpenters should draw a copy corresponding to the 2 vessels that I have sent, and they should make a drawing and build new models of these ships." End quote. That's cool. The pharaoh sent 2 of his vessels so that Hattusili, or his agents, could literally copy them and make their own. It's a wonderful case of sharing technology in order to assist his distant brother. The pharaoh also had specific instructions about building those ships. Quote, "My brother should have the frames made with skill, and pitch the ships with earthen resin on the inside and the outside, so that no water penetrates and they do not sink in the middle of the sea." End quote. I love that Ramesses includes instructions on water sealing. Apparently he didn't think much of Hittite seafaring, or they didn't have a great reputation for building ships. Fair enough. Historically, the Hittites were landlubbers, restricting their endeavors to Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. But times change, and folks must adapt. And who better to teach the Hittite than his great brother in Egypt? I guess this gift of new vessels was the very definition of a friendship. By 1251 BCE, regnal year 42, Ramesses had more than proved his commitment to the Egyptian-Hittite peace. Great transport ships now sailed regularly from the Nile Delta. Deliveries of barley and wheat would help sustain communities in the Hittite kingdom. In the big picture, we can see Egyptian-Hittite relations reaching a turning point, not from any one decision, but a long unfolding process. The references to food shortages and the need for international aid hint at troubles in the Hittite economy. Similarly, Ramesses' enthusiastic support hints at a new direction in pharaonic policy. Their former rivals were now valuable allies, and the pharaoh was willing to invest resources to support that distant kingdom. We may never know the full extent of the food shipments, or how much they actually helped, but as Hattusili and his government dealt with a serious crisis at home, Ramesses' friendship must have been a genuine boon. Henceforth, grain shipments would depart Egypt regularly, sailing along the Mediterranean coast to deliver food to Hatti. Remarkably, Ramesses' policy continued even after his death. His successor carried on dispatching food to the northern kingdom. God's willing, that aid would help turn the tide of the Hittite economic troubles. If these long-term commitments sound like a high price for peace and a bride, perhaps Ramesses felt the same way. About 10 years after the first Hittite princess came to Egypt, Ramesses asked for a second. We have a record of this second Hittite marriage on 2 stone stelae, erected at different temples in Egypt. They are much shorter than the first, and we don't learn nearly as much about this new lady. But the story goes like this. Quote, "The great ruler of Hatti sent the rich and massive tribute of that land, the rich and massive spoils of Gazga, Arzawa, of Kode, tribute that could not even be reckoned in writing. Likewise, he sent many droves of horses, many herds of cattle, many flocks of goats, many droves of game. And he sent these in front of his other daughter, whom he sent to Ramesses II on what was the second occasion. It was not the troops that brought the daughter and tribute. It was not the charioteers. It was the might of the gods of Egypt, and the gods of every foreign land. They caused the great rulers to carry tribute on their own shoulders, to carry their gold, their silver, their vessels of green stone to Ramesses II. End quote. Unlike the first Hittite marriage, we don't learn anything about this new princess. We don't know her name or even where she lived once she came to Egypt. It's also unclear why Ramesses asked for a second princess. Perhaps the great king's wife Ma'at-hor-neferura had died, and he wanted a replacement. Unfortunately, these tiny traces are all that we have of the second Hittite princess who married Ramesses II. It's not much to go on, but it's a noteworthy cap to the long relationship between Ramesses and Hatti. Finally, the inevitable happened. For nearly 30 years, Ramesses communicated frequently with his distant brother Hattusili. One day, though, word arrived from the northern kingdom. The great king was dead. Based on the surviving records of the Hittite royal household, Hattusili III died sometime around 1247 BCE, which would be the 46th year of Ramesses' reign. We don't have an explicit record of it from Egypt, but the passing of Hattusili must have been a matter of significant concern. Not only was it the end of a relationship in which Ramesses had invested huge resources, it also heralded a new period of instability within the Hittite kingdom. Following Hattusili's death, the king's second son, named Tudkhaliya, came to power. His reign was beset by difficulties. In southern Anatolia, a rebellion broke out. Then some of his brothers joined in conspiracy to murder him. Apparently, one of the conspirators was named Heshni, which might be the same chap as Hishmi Sharuma from Ramesses' letter. Tudkhaliya survived the attempt on his life and put his brothers on trial. Shortly after, though, another conspiracy arose. The king's cousin, named Kurunta, formed a small breakaway kingdom in southern Anatolia. Finally, there were invaders, but probably not the ones you're thinking of. Instead, it was the Assyrians who pushed into northern Mesopotamia and the heartland of Syria. Tudkhaliya marched forth to face the Assyrians in battle, and he lost badly. Basically, things went from bad to worse in the decades after Hattusili. But those are stories for the future. For now, the great king is gone. Ramesses has lost a brother. Across 3 decades, we can see the evolution of Ramesses' brotherhood with Hattusili. Diplomacy had started it. The treaty made it official. Marriage and a daughter unified the two families. And then regular food deliveries proved the sincerity of Ramesses' support. The diplomatic bond brought peace between two former rivals, and the value of that peace lingered in cultural memory. In fact, nearly 1,000 years after Ramesses, storytellers still remembered the brotherhood of the great kings. Like his fourth son, Ka-Waset, Ramesses II was remembered in fairy tales. One of these, known today as the Bentresh Stela, preserves a distant memory of Egyptian-Hittite friendship. The Bentresh Stela was discovered at Karnak in the early 1800s, and it's now in the Louvre in Paris. The date of the text is a little bit uncertain. Scholarly studies have ranged from the late period, around 700 BCE, all the way down to the Ptolemaic era, around 300 BCE. Beyond that, we can't be certain. But the story it tells gives a fun glimpse at how Ramesses and his foreign diplomacy had become the stuff of legend. The story begins with Ramesses traveling to northern Syria, the land of Naharina. There, he receives tribute from foreign rulers, including the monarch of a land called Bakhtan. Bakhtan is a strange word that only shows up in this tale. It might be a reference to Bactria in Central Asia, and recorded when Egypt was part of the Persian Empire. Alternatively, Bakhtan might be a corrupted reading of the hieroglyphs for Hatti, the land of the Hittites. I'll come back to that at the end, for those who are interested. Anyway, the ruler of Bakhtan comes to see Ramesses, and he brings great tribute. More importantly, the ruler brings his daughter, who will marry Ramesses. Pharaoh receives her, and she becomes the king's great wife, given the name Neferu-Ra. Here, we seem to have a memory of the actual Hittite queen, Ma'at-Hor Neferu-Ra. The couple travel back to Egypt and settle into their new lives. Soon, though, another message arrives from the distant kingdom. The princess of Bakhtan, named Bentresh, is sick. Her father requests aid. Quote, "Now, his person, Ramesses, was in Naharina, as was his custom every year. The rulers of every foreign land came, bowing down in submission because of the might of his person. Then the ruler of Bakhtan sent his tribute, and he had placed his eldest daughter at the head of it. She was extraordinarily beautiful in the opinion of the king, more than anything. Her name was established as the king's great wife, Neferu-Ra. His person arrived in Egypt, and she carried out all the duties of a king's great wife. One day, Ramesses was in the city of Waset, the victorious, the mistress of cities, doing the pleasure of his father Amun-Ra in his beautiful festival of Opet. Then someone came to inform the king that, quote, "An envoy of the ruler of Bakhtan has come, bearing many presents for the king's great wife." The messenger was ushered in before the pharaoh with his gifts. He kissed the ground before the ruler, and he said, "I have come to you, O sovereign, my lord, concerning Bentresh, the younger sister of Queen Neferu-Ra. An illness has penetrated the princess's body. May your person dispatch a knowledgeable one to see her." Thus, Ramesses summoned the personnel of the House of Life, the temple archives and schools, and the royal scribe Chehoti Heb, or Thoth in festival, came before his person. Pharaoh commanded the scribe to go to Bakhtan with this envoy. So, the knowledgeable one reached Bakhtan, and he found Bentresh in the state of one possessed by spirits. He diagnosed that, indeed, it was an enemy with whom he could contend. Then, the ruler of Bakhtan again sent word to Pharaoh, saying, "O sovereign, my lord, let his person send a god as well." This message reached the king when he was in Waset. Ramesses reported it before the great god Khonsu in Waset, and he said, "My good lord, will you go to Bakhtan?" The god agreed emphatically. His person commanded to embark Khonsu, or rather his statue, upon the great sacred barge, with 5 transport ships and abundant chariots and horses. This god reached Bakhtan in the span of 1 year and 5 months. Then the ruler of Bakhtan came out with his army and his chiefs before Khonsu. He prostrated himself, saying, "You have come to us to have mercy on us, by command of the king of southern and northern Egypt." Thus, this god went to where Bentresh was, and he bestowed magical protection upon the daughter. She was healthy straight away. The spirit that had been with the princess said to Khonsu, "Welcome in peace, O great god, who banishes the demons of disease. Bakhtan shall be your city now, and its people will be your servants. I shall go back to whence I came, to give satisfaction to your mind concerning what you came for. Thus, let your divine majesty command a festival be celebrated, with me and the ruler of Bakhtan." The festivities take place, the ruler of Bakhtan makes offerings, and everyone celebrates the princess's recovery. But the story's not done yet. Thereafter, the ruler of Bakhtan considered in his mind, saying, I will cause this god, Khonsu, to remain here in Bakhtan. I will not allow him to return to Egypt. Then this god stayed for 3 years and 9 months in Bakhtan. But one day, the ruler of Bakhtan slept on his bed, and he saw, in a dream, that this great god had come forth out of his shrine, being now a golden falcon, and he flew up and away to Egypt, Kemet. Thereupon the ruler awoke in panic, and he said to the priest of Khonsu, "This god, he is still here with us. May he now go back to Egypt, and let his chariot go back to Egypt." Thus, the ruler of Bakhtan allowed this god to proceed back. He gave to the god presents in abundance, all good things, and troops and horses in great number as an escort. They arrived peacefully in Waset. Khonsu reached his temple in year 33, the 2nd month of Peret, day 19, of the king of southern and northern Egypt, Usir Ma'at Ra Setep Enra, Ramesses II. May there be made for him the status of given life, forever and ever. The end. The Bentresh Stela is a fascinating mix of strange anachronisms and genuine historical memory. The connection between Ramesses and the distant kingdom, which is more likely to be Hatti, seems to have lingered for centuries after the event. The reference to Neferura, the daughter of the foreign ruler, is a particularly excellent detail. Clearly, this Queen Ma'at-Hor Neferura had somehow lingered in cultural memory, even though today she is barely a footnote. The idea of a god visiting a foreign land is also found in New Kingdom sources. Specifically, the Amarna letters include a fun episode where the great king Amunhotep III requested a statue of the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar to come to Egypt and help him during an illness. It wasn't a unique situation. Gods frequently traveled to other lands, either in diplomacy and pious exchange, or as the result of conquest. The Hittites, for example, took the great god away from Babylon when they captured and burned the city in the 16th century. But the idea of the foreign ruler kidnapping Khonsu is particularly fun. You have to wonder, why did the god wait for 3 years and 9 months when he could have inspired the king to send him back any old time? I guess he has his own reasons. Khonsu's gonna Khonsu. But the story clearly operates on fairy tale time rather than anything more realistic. The Bentresh Stela is largely forgotten outside of niche Egyptology, but it is a fun example of how the legend of Ramesses and his dealings with foreign kingdoms grew in the centuries after his death. It's a nice memory of Ramesses and Hattusili, and their decades of cooperation. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Stick around in a moment for a little epilogue about that Bentresh Stela and the strange land of Bakhtan. Was it Bactria or somewhere else? Before I go, I'd like to thank all my supporters on patreon.com/Egypt podcast. In particular, I must thank the priests. These are my top tier backers who give most generously every month. My thanks to Linda, Chris, Eric, Terry, TJ, Yola, Mycost, Andy and Chelsea, Nidin, Dan S., Veronica, Jeffrey, Karen, Alicia, James, Si Yen, Dan, Suyon, Uryan, Kate, Erin, Carlos, Andrew, Farhan, and Mallory. Folks, you are all most generous. May Khonsu, the Lord of Waset, travel to your home to bring you healing and prosperity in your household. Just please send the god home as soon as he is done. I would also like to thank Penrod, Mike, Laufey, August, K1W, Demolich Days, Maurizio, and Jay, who recently joined the Patreon as overseers. And thank you to Barbara, Frank, James, Karen, and Kevin, who recently joined as nobles. Folks, you are all too kind. May your houses never lack for food, and may the grain transports arrive swiftly. You are all most generous, and I am in your debt. To everyone listening, thank you for joining me. Stick around for the epilogue. Otherwise, I'll see you soon. Howdy folks, welcome to a brief epilogue where we get into some delicious nerdy details about the Bentresh Stela. Specifically, where the hell is Baktan? The word Baktan is strange. It only appears in the Bentresh Stela, but the hieroglyphs clearly define it as a land. It has the right determinatives and everything. In the late 1800s and early 20th century, scholars thought Baktan might be a reference to Bactria in Central Asia. That was based on Persian texts, when they ruled Egypt, that referenced Bactria as Bakcher. Scholars like Ehrman and Spiegelberg thought Baktan might be a version of that. Okay, that's a start. However, the argument did have problems. The word Bactria is spelled quite differently to Baktan, and they're visually distinct too in the hieroglyphs, so an ancient scribe would be unlikely to get them confused. So what's going on? In 1977, an Egyptologist named Anthony Spellinger gave a compelling reinterpretation. Going back to the hieroglyphs, Spellinger argued that Baktan was actually a corrupted version of Hatti. Essentially, the hieroglyphs for Hatti, or Kheta in Egyptian, are remarkably similar in shape to those used for Baktan. Specifically, one of the glyphs for Hatti, which involves a type of jug, looks a lot like the leg and foot for B, and the determinative ta, meaning land, is easy to mistake for the hieroglyph for N. As Spellinger argued, some ancient scribe had studied Ramesses' references to Hatti, but he had misread two of the glyphs, with the result that his version came out as Baktan. Spellinger's interpretation seems stronger than Bactria for two reasons. Firstly, the rest of the story already has a focus on Syria, Naharina, and it includes explicit reference to the Hittite queen, Neferura, so there's clearly more Anatolian and Syrian influence in the tale. Secondly, the hieroglyphs for Hatti are visually closer to Baktan than the hieroglyphs for Bactria. Put all of that together, and the Bentresh Stela may have been misinterpreted for nearly 100 years. Surprisingly, Spellinger's interpretation has not made it out into the general public. You'll still find casual references to the Bentresh Stela as a tale of Bactria, which is a shame. Obviously, we're way deep into the academic weeds here, but the Bentresh Stela is a good example of how careful you have to be when studying ancient texts. As generations of scholars build upon each other's work, they develop greater understandings of language and the physical context of inscriptions or monuments. This can have a massive impact on how they analyze and interpret the past. Sometimes, interpretations or theories that previously seemed ironclad can crumble away completely with new evidence or simply a new perspective on the existing material. The Bentresh Stela is a nice example of that phenomenon.